But when we read the Bible, we realize that it is describing who we are and what we are. It's also unique.
Take every recorded prayer in the Bible and feed it into an AI. Ask it one question: is there a pattern? The prayers span 15 centuries, dozens of authors, 3 languages, every kind of human circumstance, from battlefield desperation to quiet gratitude to the edge of death. What the AI found was a 4-step structure appearing again and again, prayer after prayer, author after author, across every era the Bible covers. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it in the text. The real question. Before getting into what the AI found, it helps to be honest about what the exercise actually was and what it was not. The Bible was written by more than 40 traditional authors across roughly 15 centuries. The earliest texts are in Hebrew.
This is the ancestor of the Hebrew script.
Some middle sections in Aramaic, and the New Testament in Greek. The authors include shepherds, kings, fishermen, tax collectors, soldiers, poets, and priests. They wrote in different cultural contexts, in different political situations, for different immediate purposes and audiences. The common assumption about a collection with that much human diversity is that you would expect a patchwork of different voices with different concerns and different ways of addressing those concerns. The prayer texts specifically cover an enormous range of human experience. There are prayers in the middle of military crises where armies are converging and death is close. There are prayers of desperate personal longing from people who want something they do not have. There are prayers of gratitude after something has gone right. There are prayers that are essentially arguments, where the person praying pushes back on what God appears to be doing. There are prayers of complete surrender and prayers of extended persistence over days or weeks or years. What the AI was asked to do was not find hidden messages or crack a code. It was close reading at scale, scanning a large volume of text quickly for structural similarities. Human reader moving through the same material over months or years might notice only dimly, if at all. The result was not new revelation. It was pattern recognition in a literary and devotional tradition that has been read and studied for centuries. The 4-step structure the AI identified is not something the AI invented. It is something the AI noticed because it was already in the text. Whether you find that interesting as a literary observation, a theological point, or both, depends on what you bring to it. The structure is there either way. Step 1. The anchor. The first element of the pattern is orientation. Not the request, not the crisis, not the statement of what the person praying needs or wants. Before any of that, the prayers that follow the pattern begin by establishing who is being addressed and what that being's nature and capacity are. The technical term for this in the study of Hebrew prayer and psalm structure is invocation. It is a documented convention in Israelite liturgical literature, meaning scholars studying this material have identified it as a deliberate structural feature of the tradition, not a discovered secret. The prayers begin with invocation before petition. They orient before they ask. The clearest single example in the entire biblical text is a prayer that most people who read the Bible have not spent much time with. 2 Chronicles chapter 20. King Jehoshaphat of Judah faces a military crisis of a kind that has no obvious solution. 3 allied armies are advancing against his kingdom simultaneously. The numerical disadvantage is overwhelming. The text describes Jehoshaphat as afraid, which is the honest and reasonable response to the situation he is in. His prayer does not begin with the military situation. It begins with declarations. He addresses God as the God of our ancestors, acknowledges divine rule over all the kingdoms of the nations, and notes that power and might are in God's hand so that no one can withstand God. He goes through the history of the relationship between God and Israel, citing specific past events and the promises connected to them. He establishes in detail who it is he is talking to and what that entity has been and done before he ever states what he needs. Only after this extended orientation does Jehoshaphat name the actual crisis. He describes the 3 advancing armies. He states clearly that he does not know what to do, and then he adds a phrase that connects directly to the opening. His eyes are on God. The invocation was not decorative, it was functional. By the time he states the crisis has already been placed in a larger context than the crisis itself. The outcome the text records is striking. The three allied armies turn on each other without Judah fighting at all. Whatever theological interpretation a reader brings to that outcome, the literary structure of the prayer that precedes it is clear and consistent with what the AI flagged as the first element of the pattern, the function of starting with orientation. Establishing who you are addressing before you state what you need changes the nature of what follows. A request made to an entity whose nature and capacity you have just articulated is a different kind of request than a demand made into a void. The anchor does not change the external situation. It changes the relationship of the person praying to the external situation before anything else has shifted. Alignment. The second element of the pattern is the one that most distinguishes the prayers following the structure from simple petitions. It is not enough to ask for what you want. The prayers that carry the full pattern reframe the personal request as being in service of something larger than the person doing the asking. This is not a minor rhetorical adjustment. It is a fundamental shift in the nature of the request. The person praying is not simply articulating a desire and hoping it will be granted. They are positioning the desire within a purpose that extends beyond their personal benefit, aligning what they want with what they understand the larger project to be. Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel chapter 1 is one of the clearest examples of this element in action. Hannah wants a son. She has been unable to conceive, and the anguish of this situation is described in the text with enough specificity that the emotional reality of her circumstances is not in question. The desire she brings to prayer is intensely personal, but the vow she makes in the same moment of prayer is not personal. She promises that if she receives a son, the son will be dedicated to God's service from his birth and throughout his life. Hannah does not ask for a son and then add a vow as a secondary condition. The vow is simultaneous with the request. She is not bargaining, she is aligning. The child she is asking for will not be hers to keep. He will be given back. What she is asking for and what she is willing to release are stated together in the same prayer as two aspects of a single orientation. Solomon's prayer in 1 Kings chapter 3 works the same way. God appears to Solomon and offers him whatever he requests. This is one of the more extraordinary setups in the entire biblical narrative. A direct offer, unlimited in scope, with no preconditions stated. Solomon could ask for wealth, he could ask for military victory, he could ask for a long life. He asks instead for wisdom, specifically for the ability to govern well and to judge fairly between people. He explicitly ties his request to the purpose of serving the people he is responsible for, rather than to his own benefit. The text records that God's response to Solomon's alignment is to give him not only what he asked for, but the things he did not ask for as well. Whether that outcome is read literally or as a theological teaching about the principle being illustrated, the structure of the prayer itself is the same as Hannah's. Personal want and larger purpose are aligned in the same moment. The request is made specific, but simultaneously released from purely personal ownership. The scholarly connection here is to covenant theology, the framework that runs through the Hebrew Scriptures describing a relationship of mutual obligation between God and Israel. Within that framework, the alignment of individual requests with larger covenantal purposes is not a technique for getting what you want. It is a reflection of how the relationship is understood to work. Reciprocity and purpose are built into the structure of the tradition, not discovered by AI scanning prayer texts for patterns. Step 3. Surrender. The third pattern is often the hardest for people to understand because it seems to combine two opposite ideas. On one hand, the person praying makes a clear and specific request. On the other hand, they let go of complete control over the result. Many people think prayer means either asking with complete certainty that God will grant a request or giving up on asking altogether. The biblical examples show a different approach. They encourage people to speak honestly about what they want, while trusting God with the final outcome. One of the clearest examples appears in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, during Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Only hours remain before his arrest and crucifixion. The Gospel describes him as deeply troubled and overwhelmed with sorrow. He falls to the ground and prays with intense emotion, fully aware of the suffering that lies ahead. His request is simple, direct, and deeply personal. He asks the Father if it is possible for the coming suffering to pass from him. There is no attempt to hide his pain or pretend he feels differently, but the prayer does not end with that request. Jesus immediately adds another statement that changes the entire structure of the prayer. "Yet not as I will, but as you will." These words do not erase his request or suggest that he no longer means it. Instead, they place his personal desire within a larger framework of trust. He clearly expresses what he hopes for while accepting that God's purpose may lead in another direction. This balance is one reason the Gethsemane prayer has remained so important throughout Christian history. It demonstrates that faith does not require pretending difficult emotions do not exist. Jesus openly acknowledges fear, sorrow, and the desire to avoid suffering. At the same time, he refuses to let those emotions become the final authority. The request and the surrender exist together. Neither cancels the other. Interestingly, modern psychology describes a similar pattern without making any theological claims. One example comes from dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, developed by psychologist Marsha Linehan. A key concept in DBT is called radical acceptance. It teaches people to acknowledge reality as it actually is, rather than constantly fighting against circumstances they cannot change. Acceptance does not mean approving of pain or pretending it is good. It means recognizing the situation honestly so that emotional energy is not consumed by resistance alone. Research on radical acceptance has consistently shown that it can reduce emotional suffering, lower stress, and improve a person's ability to cope with difficult experiences. The circumstances themselves may remain exactly the same, but the person's relationship to those circumstances often changes. Instead of becoming trapped in frustration, anger, or fear, people are better able to respond thoughtfully and make healthier decisions. This does not prove the truth of Christian theology, and psychologists do not claim that biblical prayers inspired modern therapy. However, it is striking that two very different traditions point toward a similar pattern. One comes from ancient religious writings, preserved over thousands of years. The other comes from modern clinical research based on observation and evidence. Both recognize that there is value in holding a sincere desire while releasing the need to control every outcome. The surrender seen in the Gethsemane prayer is therefore not passive resignation or defeat. It is an active decision to trust while remaining honest. The request is specific, the hope is genuine, the acceptance is intentional. Together, these elements form a pattern that has shaped Christian prayer for centuries and continues to find echoes in modern psychological understanding of how people face uncertainty, suffering, and the limits of human control. Step 4. Persistence. The fourth element of the pattern is the one that cuts most directly against the way many people approach prayer as a single event. The prayers that carry the full structure do not end after one expression. They continue. Elijah's prayer for rain in 1 Kings chapter 18 is one of the most structurally specific examples of this element in the entire text. The context is a 3-year drought. Elijah goes to the top of a mountain, prays, and sends his servant to look toward the sea. The servant sees nothing. Elijah prays again. The servant is sent again, nothing. This sequence repeats 7 times before the servant reports a small cloud forming on the horizon. The rain that follows ends the 3-year drought. The text does not explain why 7 repetitions were necessary. It does not comment on the mechanism. It describes a pattern of behavior, extended, repeated engagement, rather than a single request followed by waiting. The persistence is the structure, not an explanation of what the persistence causes or why it is required. Daniel chapter 10 provides a different version of the same pattern, along with one of the more unusual textual details in the entire Bible. Daniel has been in extended prayer and fasting for 21 days when an angelic figure appears to him and explains the delay. The explanation the text gives is that the messenger was resisted by a described spiritual adversary for the entire 21-day period and required assistance before the message could be delivered. This is worth mentioning as what the text says rather than as an external claim about spiritual mechanics. The text offers a specific supernatural explanation for the delay between Daniel's prayer and the response he receives. Whether a reader accepts that explanation at face value, reads it as symbolic, or treats it as mythological framing is a matter of their own interpretive framework. What is clear from the text itself is that the 21-day period of persistence was not waiting for God to decide whether to respond. Something else is described as happening during that period. Persistence as a devotional and liturgical theme is well documented in both Jewish and Christian religious traditions. Daily prayer practices, liturgical calendars, fasting periods, and extended retreat practices are all structured around the idea that sustained engagement, rather than single-event asking, is the normal pattern of serious devotional life. The AI's finding that persistence appears consistently across the prayer texts in the biblical record is not a discovery. It is a confirmation that the texts reflect the same pattern that the broader traditions built their practices around. Why the structure keeps appearing? The most important thing to be honest about when looking at the four-step pattern the AI identified is that there are several different explanations for why it appears, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first explanation is shared literary convention. The biblical authors, whatever their individual contexts and circumstances, were working within and influenced by a continuous literary and theological tradition. Later authors read and were shaped by earlier authors. The Psalms influenced how later biblical writers approached prayer. The prophetic traditions shaped how the narrative writers described prayer in their accounts. Structural repetition in a body of literature produced by writers consciously building on and responding to earlier texts in the same tradition is expected, not surprising. Scholars call this intertextuality, and it is a standard feature of how the biblical texts relate to each other. The second explanation is liturgical formation. Many of the prayer texts in the Bible were not composed purely as private expressions of individual experience. They were shaped for communal use in worship settings. Texts used in communal worship naturally develop recurring structural patterns because those patterns serve the purposes of collective practice. They create expectations, establish rhythms, and allow large groups of people to participate in a shared devotional experience. The structural consistency the AI found may reflect not a hidden pattern, but the functional requirements of texts designed for communal liturgical use. The third explanation is the one that the tradition itself holds. Within the faith communities that read these texts as scripture, the consistency of the pattern across 15 centuries and dozens of human authors is understood as reflecting the consistency of a single divine author working through those human writers. On this reading, the pattern appears because it reflects something about how the divine genuinely operates in response to prayer. And the human authors across all those centuries were all describing the same reality from their own situated perspectives. These explanations are genuinely different from each other. They are also not mutually exclusive. A text can be shaped by literary convention and liturgical formation and also be understood by its tradition as reflecting divine authorship. The honest position is that each of these explanations accounts for some of what is observed, and the question of which is most complete is not one that the AI's pattern recognition can settle. It is a question that requires the kind of judgment that only human readers bringing their full interpretive frameworks to the text can make. The numbers question. The AI analysis also flagged something about numerical patterns in the prayer texts that requires careful handling because it sits close to territory that has generated a great deal of confusion and some significant scholarly controversy. Hebrew and Greek, the primary languages of the Bible, are languages in which letters carry numeric values. The practice of reading texts for their numeric content based on the values of the letters is called gematria in Hebrew and isoposy in Greek. This is real, historically documented, and genuinely used in rabbinic literature and early Christian writing. It is not invented or fringe. The question is, what conclusions can legitimately be drawn from it? The number 7 appears with extraordinary frequency across the biblical texts. The 7-day creation week, the 7 feast days in the Levitical calendar, the 7 years of the tribulation period in prophetic literature, the 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls of revelations, the 7 repetitions of Elijah's prayer, the 7 times Naaman dips in the Jordan. This prominence is not coincidental and is not disputed by mainstream biblical scholars. The number 7 is intentionally used as a symbol of completion or divine fullness throughout the biblical tradition. This is well established. Where this territory becomes contested is when claims move from symbolic structuring to hidden encoded messages. In the 1990s, a significant popular controversy arose around claims that the Hebrew text of the Torah contained hidden messages encoded in equidistant letter sequences, patterns of letters spaced at regular intervals that supposedly spelled out words and phrases predicting historical events. These claims were investigated seriously by statisticians and were found to be methodologically problematic. The patterns identified were not significantly different from patterns that could be found in other Hebrew texts of comparable length, and the statistical methodology used to identify them was challenged by multiple independent researchers. The claims are largely discredited in academic circles, though they continue to circulate popularly. The honest distinction to draw for anyone interested in this area is between two different things that are sometimes bundled together as if they were the same. Intentional symbolic numerical structuring in the biblical texts, the deliberate use of numbers like 7 as meaningful theological symbols, is real, documented, and uncontroversial among scholars. Claims about hidden encoded messages produced by letter spacing algorithms are contested, methodologically disputed, and largely rejected by the academic community that has studied them most carefully. The AI flagged numerical patterns in the prayer texts. The patterns it found are in the first category, not the second. The structural prominence of 7 cycle patterns in several of the major prayer texts is the same prominence that mainstream biblical scholarship has been discussing for decades. It is not a new discovery. What to do with this? The 4-step pattern identified in the biblical prayers is not something that only artificial intelligence can recognize. It does not require advanced software, a research lab, or a team of scholars. Anyone with a Bible, enough time, and a willingness to read carefully can see it. The value of AI in this case is not that it uncovered a hidden secret. Instead, it quickly analyzed a large collection of passages and highlighted a recurring structure that careful readers could also discover on their own through patient study. In other words, the AI did not invent the pattern or place it into the text. It simply pointed out something that was already there. That makes it a useful research tool rather than the source of the conclusion. Once the pattern is identified, readers can return to the original passages and examine them for themselves without relying on the AI's interpretation. Several biblical prayers provide good examples for this kind of study. Jehoshaphat's prayer in 2 Chronicles 20 begins by recognizing God's power before presenting a request. Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel 1 expresses a deeply personal desire while connecting it to a greater purpose. Solomon's request in 1 Kings 3 asks for wisdom, not personal wealth or success, placing the needs of the people above his own interests. In Matthew 26, Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, expressing a clear desire while also accepting God's will. Elijah's prayer in 1 Kings 18 carefully builds toward its request, and Daniel's experience in Daniel 10 shows persistence through 21 days of continued prayer. As you read these passages, look beyond the individual words and pay attention to their overall structure. Notice how many of them begin with an acknowledgement of God's character or authority before asking for anything. Watch for the moment when a personal request becomes connected to something larger than individual comfort or success. Observe how specific desires are often expressed alongside trust that the final outcome belongs to God. Finally, notice that many of these prayers involve persistence rather than a single request followed by immediate results. Once these patterns are pointed out, they become surprisingly easy to recognize. The passages differ in setting, purpose, and historical background, yet they often share the same basic framework. The AI simply made that framework easier to notice by comparing many texts at once. The larger question, however, is one that technology cannot answer. These prayers were written over roughly 15 centuries by many different authors. They were composed in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, addressed different audiences, and emerged from very different historical situations. Yet the same broad structure appears again and again in some of the Bible's most memorable prayers. Why does that happen? Some readers may see it as a literary tradition passed from one generation to another. Others may view it as the result of shared patterns of worship or religious teaching. Still others may believe it reflects a consistent way that Scripture presents communication with God. Those are questions of interpretation, not questions that AI can settle. What remains undeniable is that the text is available to everyone. The pattern is not hidden behind technology or academic expertise. It is waiting in the pages of Scripture for anyone willing to slow down, read carefully, compare passages, and draw their own conclusions. The pattern is real. It has been sitting in the text for 15 centuries waiting for anyone willing to read closely enough to find it. No AI required, no secret study, just the passages and attention. Go back and reread those prayers with the 4 steps in mind. Tell us what you notice in the comments. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next.